The Joe Rogan Experience.
And so first I had to go down the flu vaccine bunny trail. And every time I went down that flu vaccine bunny trail, guess what I was asked? What about polio?
Right.
So I thought, all right, even though this has absolutely zero to do with polio because I'm watching people crap out in front of me after influenza vaccines, let's see about polio. Because I knew very little about polio, just like most people walking around out there do, that, it was invented by this guy named Jonas Salk and it saved humanity. We don't see these little crippled kids anymore. We don't have iron lungs anymore. Yay. Well, I would have to say that the polio bunny trail was the darkest one of all.
Because that's the big one.
Yeah.
Right? This is the one that everybody points to. We don't have crippled kids.
Yeah.
When you look at the historical timeline of polio, what do you think caused it to go, to essentially not be a problem anymore?
Okay.
You don't think vaccinations had anything to do with that?
Well, it's not what I think, because that's the thing. Like, look, when I got into this, I didn't say, I want to argue that vaccines are great. I said, look, I don't care. I didn't have skin in the game. I didn't have vaccine-injured kids. I couldn't have cared less about it, essentially, except that it was something in front of me and it didn't make sense. So I thought, wherever the truth falls, that's what I'm going to talk about. So what I say is that what the facts line up to show you is that polio is still here. Polio is still alive and well. Polio is called different things today, whereas back in the 1940s, 1950s, the criteria for diagnosing polio were completely different to the year that the vaccine was introduced. The playing field, the goalposts, everything was changed so that despite the fact that there was more paralytic polio in the years after that vaccine was introduced, they were able to show a complete cascading drop of paralytic polio simply because of the way they changed the definitions of what polio is and what could cause it. And they started testing for the virus, where before they would never test for the virus. And when they started testing for the virus later, what they would find that people had Guillain-Barré syndrome, they didn't have virus, or they had Coxsackie virus or echovirus, or they were lead poisoned or mercury poisoned, which was the mercury and lead were the leading treatments of the day, including bloodletting. They were telling people to take your cigarette and put a little bit of arsenic in there. It's good for your lungs. Yeah. They were literally blowing smoke up people's butts. Like that's where the term comes from. Because if you want to Google that now, you'll see that there's an instrument that does it.
Yeah.
So, the polio story, where to even begin? And so there's about 70 pages. And so that became my obsession. So when people said, what about polio? And I started digging this up, I went deep into it.
Did you dive into pesticides?
Yes. You have to dive into pesticides. Yeah. Because the tonnage of production of DDT absolutely mirrored the diagnosis for polio in the days. And the countries that still make DDT today is where we're still seeing this paralytic polio situation happen.
And also, weren't the first cases, did they break out in a rural community?
The first cases of polio, yes.
In the United States, paralytic polio.
Yes, it was out in the countryside. Well, and that was probably more because of the sheep and cow dipping. So arsenic, you have to look at arsenic, you have to look at the mercurials, you have to look at the calcium arsenate, lead arsenate sprays that were put on trees. But what you're talking about in particular, they would call the cow disease. They would go out in the family, when you would go to the house, they'd say, all the kids have the cow disease, what the cows had before. Well, what were they doing? They would have these trenches. You talk to farmers, even today. Oh, yeah, we had trenches. We would just walk them straight through, and I'd be soaked with the stuff by the end of the day.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So they're basically soaking and bathing in arsenic, which is great for killing fleas and ticks. But it's not really great for keeping your nervous system happy, because the fact of the matter is, and this again, I've got medical references, everything. I can't get away with making stuff up, okay? I have to put a reference for everything. But arsenic causes the exact same spinal pathology and fevers and everything. It literally mimics what they were calling polio and a polio virus back in the day.
I read this crazy statistic, and I still can't believe it's real, that 95 to 99% of all polio is asymptomatic.
That's exactly right. So polio virus is what we call a commensal. Just like you have staph on your skin and strep on your skin, and it actually serves a purpose. It keeps other microbes in check as long as you don't get a cut and have not a good immune system to deal from the inside out. So polio, the reason I can say that polio is a commensal is because, again, there are medical studies that showed that people who dared to get on the edge of some of these wild native tribes down in South America or elsewhere. But in particular, I'm talking about a South American tribe called the Javante Indians. So the Indian Health Service got to the edge of it and bargained that they would get some stool and some blood from the tribes so that they could test it for polio. And what they found was 98 to 99% of every person they tested, and it was hundreds of people, had evidence of immunity to all 3 strains of polio. And they said to them, well, where are all your crippled children? Where's your short legs? Where are the people that died of respiratory failure? And they were like, we don't have any of that problem. So it was well known.
Could it possibly be that whatever you're calling polio evolved and became less powerful over time and more contagious? That does happen with some viruses, right? Most
viruses in nature don't become more problematic as they go through the human system. They become less problematic. Remember
right.
the whole COVID thing. Like in the beginning, people were getting super, super sick. It wasn't as contagious, but it was more virulent. And as it attenuated into the human bodies, it sort of it kind of fizzled out a bit. And then we got the Omicron, which was less. It was more spreadable, but it was much less pathological. And that's the natural process that happens. So when you're going to have real problems with microbes, they're usually going to be reverse attenuated, meaning made more lethal in a lab, and then they're introduced into the population. And look, I'm not making this up either. 1916, Upper East Side, Manhattan, there was a Rockefeller lab that their specific stated goal was to try to create the most pathological, neuropathological strain of polio possible. And they did that by taking monkey brains and human spinal serum and injecting it into monkeys. And there was a big problem with that, which was released into the public by accident. And the world experienced the worst polio epidemic on record, 25% mortality. That's unheard of. Really freaked the public out. But you can see the epicenter as it fanned out. And as it fanned out and as time went on, never heard of it again. It attenuates as it moves through the body because it's a normal human commensal that goes back to its normal state when it's in a human. And that's generally what happens. If you have a highly lethal virus and it kills a lot of people, those people are dead. They can't spread anything. So that's kind of a different story if you want to talk about hantavirus or something like that. But as far as polio goes, no, polio was only made more lethal by the stupid things that humans did around it. So make it more invasive into the body, just like you can go do stupid things and end up with herpes outbreaks and, staph outbreaks. Polio virus is a normal commensal. It used to be until we obliterated it with oral vaccines and replaced it with vaccine strain. But the wild strains are normal human commensals.
So there's vaccine strain polio that just comes from a vaccine and is transmissible?
Absolutely. Today, it would be the oral polio vaccines because they're the live strains, and they're still giving them pulse fashion all throughout India. They did a campaign a few years back in Israel, and they always say that a nomad came and, pooped in the sewage system, and they find it in the sewage system, and they don't want an outbreak to happen, so they treat everybody. So that's today the most common reason to see poliomyelitis disease from a virus. If you test for a virus, they'll usually find the vaccine virus. And that's why today we don't, remember when we were kids, because we're about the same age, I think, they would give us the sugar cube. Maybe you didn't, but I did. I got the sugar cube, and that was the live vaccine. Well, they stopped doing that because after a while, the only cases of polio, and it became so obvious that the only cases of polio we were seeing related to a virus when they tested for polio virus were vaccine strains. So then they started injecting us again. But the early injections caused more paralytic polio than it prevented. And that's the part that people don't understand when they say, what about polio? Because they like you, just go, well, there's no more iron lungs, there's no more crippling, there's no more these poor little kids walking around with their casts. Well, that's not true because the iron lung is now called a ventilator. So that's out the window. Transverse myelitis, which there are about 1,300 cases, I think it's a month, diagnosed in one particular, I put a quote in here on that. But transverse myelitis is actually something that would have it follows the same pathology as polio. It would have been called polio back in the day. So we still have polio that we had in 1953 because in 1953, all you had to have to be diagnosed as polio. Anyone could diagnose you, just one examination with one set of muscles being paralyzed. There was no time frame on it. There was no testing done on it. And then it was considered a public service to do it because then you were eligible for funding.
So what do they call it again? Can you say that word again? Myelitis?
Poliomyelitis is the definition of the actual pathology. So it basically means inflammation of the gray matter of your spinal cord. That's what polio in Greek, poliomyelitis. It means gray matter inflammation, poliomyelitis. Poliomyelitis is what happens in the body. Okay, if you want to talk about what causes it, then okay, maybe in some cases a poliovirus causes it, and all the other things we just mentioned: arsenic, lead arsenate, calcium arsenate. Injections, tonsillectomies were a huge cause of some of the worst cases of poliomyelitis. And in fact, injections and tonsillectomies and unnecessary surgeries were put on hold during the years where the epidemics were the worst. So that's just proof that even the surgeons knew that.
Why? How does it affect it?
Okay, so if you happen to have poliomyelitis circulating in your body that's not just sitting in your intestines and say it made its way into your body, because things can go from your intestines into your body, and you happen to have it close to a nerve that's up, say, around your throat, and then you go and take the tonsils out, then what you've done is you've given that access to the blood compartment, the lymph compartment, and the brain stem, which is right there, local. So those are the people that would get what was called bulbar polio, which is the ones that put you on a ventilator, and it's highly lethal. It's the worst kind of polio to get, bulbar polio, and it was very well known to have been coincident with tonsillectomies. Not only that, but tonsillectomies changed the structure and antibodies and the immunity that occurred in the throat, and it changed it for the worse, not for the better. Everybody's got their two vaccines, that their two diseases they're afraid of for their kid that makes them feel like they're at least doing something.
Well, the polio one always gets thrown in my face.
Yeah.
They say it all the time.
What about polio?
Yeah, and I just go, I don't have the time to do this.
Thank you. Read the book.
Read the book. To explain to someone the whole DDT connection and the fact that livestock was getting polio. Like, this is the thing. Like, polio, dogs don't get polio. They don't get human-derived polio. It doesn't cross species. But they were getting paralytic polio symptoms because they were getting poisoned by DDT. Right? That was a big part of the whole thing that was very confusing.
Well, they started killing dogs. In New York, in that incident I told you about where the vaccine, the gain-of-function strain escaped, people were throwing their cats out the window. Some 20,000 cats in New York City were killed during that time. God. Because there was a belief that cats spread the disease.
Oh, my God. Jesus Christ. That's so crazy. And it was all a mutant man-made virus. The man-made virus thing is...
It was a wound-up virus. Wound up by. It was basically a natural virus that got kind of wound up by
So
humans.
Man-made to the final form.
So no, I didn't have apprehension. I was like, this information, it's been so... The U.S. Polio Surveillance Unit charts were supposed to be available in libraries. Lo and behold, every library I went to find them, I was told they're not here. There's only one library, the AMA library, and you have to have special high security clearance to look at them. Well, I won't say how, but I got a hold of them. And what those documents show is that it wasn't just Cutter Laboratories that had a problem with live polio. It wasn't just Wyeth. All the vaccine we didn't talk about this, but all the vaccine companies had a problem with live virus in their injectable vaccines during Salk's year. So 1954, 1955, up to 1959, they all were producing vaccine with live virus in it because Salk wouldn't listen to the scientists abroad who were saying his inactivation curve was where the sun doesn't shine. So that beginning of that and just tracking all that down and asking the questions that you asked, well, where did polio go? What was really causing the paralysis? Why don't we see it today? Like, I had to answer all those questions, and every question I answered, it was so satisfying that I just wanted to go on to the next question. And so there was never any hesitation because I was so single-minded that I didn't think about, the threats that could happen as a result of that. And it wasn't until after the book was out that the threats happened, and I'm still here. And look, I figure if anybody wants to do me in now, the timing is really bad because this is pretty much out there now.
It's been out there for a while. The Jonas Salk thing was also wild. I thought Jonas Salk was this genius that created this incredible virus that saved humanity.
Yeah, so did I. So many of our childhood fables turn out not to be true. But that was a big one, and it's still hard for a lot of people to believe.